I was an officer. And if 7 of us had to die on the way and the 8th could have been saved by the convoy, what was to keep me from crying out, "Sergeant, save me! I am an officer!" And that's what an officer is, even when his shoulder boards aren't blue. And if they are blue? If he's been indoctrinated to believe that even among other officers he is the salt of the earth? And that he knows more than others and is entrusted with more responsibility than others, and that, consequently, it is his duty to force a prisoner's head between his legs and then shove him like that into a pipe? Why shouldn't he? I credited myself with unselfish dedication, but meanwhile I had been thoroughly prepared to be an executioner. And if I had gotten into an NKVD school under Yezhov, maybe I would have matured just in time for Beria. So let the reader who expects this book to be a political exposé slam its cover shut right now. If only it were so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were only necessary to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being, and who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? Alexander Solzhenitsyn, The Gulag Archipelago. Hello, Endeavor here. A rainbow curtain has descended across North America, Western Europe, and Australasia. The past year has seen the consolidation of power across the Western world into the hands of a hostile globalist elite. The West now finds itself under a new kind of rule, one which seeks to control all aspects of our lives to craft a new humanity for the benefit of the elite and which will not tolerate any dissent. If there is one book for our time, it's The Gulag Archipelago by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I read the book over the course of several months during 2020. While I witnessed the Western world undergo the most sinister year in living memory, the book I was reading was The Gulag Archipelago. And I feel that the insight of the book is so valuable today because it's possibly the most comprehensive look into the nature of totalitarianism ever written. The book covers the Gulag system in the USSR from 1918 to 1956. Starting immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution all the way to Nikita Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalinism 3 years after Stalin's death. Solzhenitsyn writes of both his own experiences in the Soviet system of totalitarianism and the stories of hundreds of others. Now, I don't want to use the word totalitarianism lightly. It may seem hyperbolic to compare the West today to the worst years of the USSR. And to be fair, it hasn't gotten nearly that bad. Yet. However, the most reminiscent aspect of the Gulag Archipelago to the modern-day West is not the horrors of the camps themselves, but the ideological foundations on which the totalitarian system was built. And I need to make it clear that the system that rules the West today is not communism, it is something else. But the underpinnings of totalitarianism described in the Gulag Archipelago do bear an uncanny resemblance to that of the zeitgeist that rules the Western world today. And that's what I want to look at in this video. What are some similarities and differences between the Soviet system of totalitarianism as described by Solzhenitsyn to that of the system of intersexual neoliberal anarcho-tyranny which rules the West today? The first and most obvious similarity is that both systems rely on an egalitarian utopian understanding of man and society. They both believe that human equality is true and attainable through the work of human institution. It relies on the Rousseauian notion that man in nature is good and that his imperfections are the result of a failure of human institution rather than his own nature. Soviet communism claimed it would bring about a classless, equal society where human want and need would be done away with. While progressivism, the ideology of the West today, does not necessarily want to eliminate class inequality, its claim to legitimacy is that it will eliminate inequality between races and genders. Communism sees class equality as attainable with the overthrow of capitalism. Progressivism sees racial and gender equality as attainable with the removal of racism, sexism, and homophobia, or white supremacy as it's become fashionable to call it. It's all for the goal of equality. The problem is that equality is a lie. The utopian ambitions of both systems are delusional. Just like how class has always existed and all human societies have had hierarchies, race and gender are not social constructs and have a profound impact on the individual and society as a whole. And this cannot be overcome through any human institution. And it's this fundamental lie from which totalitarianism springs. The next characteristic shared by both Soviet and intersectional totalitarianism: ideological infallibility. No matter how much they fail to deliver upon the promises of bringing about equality, the ideological foundations of the system can never be questioned. Not ever. The USSR under Stalin, the society which imprisoned Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag, claimed to be a workers' paradise. But the reality was nothing like the promise. The quality of life of the average worker was far below that of other Western countries at the time. But it could never be considered for even a second that communism might be wrong. The ideology of communism was deemed infallible. If it didn't bring about the workers' paradise, there must be some other explanation for why, because communism could never be wrong. So all of its failings were attributed to other factors. It was the counter-revolutionaries, it was the kulaks, it was because of the Tsar's era. Or that Stalin's USSR actually was the workers' paradise and blatant failures were just denied. I'm going to read out an exchange Solzhenitsyn had with another prisoner in a train compartment, a former Marxist scholar who had been arrested too. It really demonstrates just how willing to delude themselves some were to uphold the ideology. Quote, "Hello.
Hello.
You're not too crowded?
No, it's all right.
Have you been in the jug for a long time?
Long enough.
Are you past the halfway mark?
Just.
Look over there. How poverty-stricken our villages are. Straw-thatched, crooked huts.
An inheritance from the Tsarist regime.
Well, but we've already had 30 Soviet years.
That's an insignificant period historically.
It's terrible that the collective farmers are starving.
But have you looked in all their ovens?
Just ask any collective farmer in our compartment.
Everyone in jail is embittered and prejudiced.
But I've been to the collective farms myself.
That means they were uncharacteristic.
Side note, he had never been to any of them. That way it was simpler. Just ask the old folks. Under the Tsar, they were well-fed, well-clothed, and they used to have so many holidays.
I'm not even going to ask. It's a subjective trait of human memory to praise everything about the past. The cow that died is the one that gave twice the milk. And our people don't like holidays. They like to work.
But why is there a shortage of bread in many cities?
When?
Right before the war, for example.
Not true. Before the war, in fact, everything had been worked out.
Listen, at that time, in all the cities on the Volga, there were queues of thousands of people.
Some local failure in supply, but more likely your memory is failing you.
But there's a shortage now.
Old wives' tales. We've had from 7 to 8 billion poods of grain.
And the grain itself is rotten.
Not at all. We have been successful in developing new varieties of grain.
But in many shops, the shelves are empty.
Inefficient distribution in local areas.
Yes, and the prices are high. The workers have to do without many things.
Our prices are more scientifically based than anywhere else.
That means the wages are low.
And the wages, too, are scientifically based.
That means they're based in such a way that the worker has to work for the state for free the greater part of the time.
You don't know anything about economics. What is your profession?
Engineer.
And I am an economist. Don't argue. Surplus value is even impossible here.
But why is it that the father of a family used to be able to feed his family by his own labor, and that now 2 or 3 in the family have to work?
Because there was unemployment previously, and the wife couldn't get work, and the family went hungry. Furthermore, the wife's working is important for her equality.
What the devil do you mean by equality? And who does all the household work?
The husband has to help.
And how about you? Did you help your wife?
I am not married.
So each of them used to work during the day, and now both of them have to work in the evening too. And the woman has no time for the main thing, for bringing up the children.
She has quite enough. They are mainly brought up by the kindergarten, school, and komsomol.
Well, and how are they bringing them up? They grow up to be hooligans and petty thieves, and the girls run free and loose.
Not at all. Our youth have lofty principles.
That's what the papers say, but our papers tell lies.
They are much more honest than the bourgeois newspapers. You ought to read the bourgeois newspapers.
Just give me the chance.
That's not necessary at all.
And our papers still tell lies.
They are openly bound to the proletariat.
That's the kind of bringing up that makes the crime rate grow.
On the contrary, it's failing. Give me the statistics.
Side note, this is a country where even the number of sheep tails is classified as a secret. And another reason our crime rate is rising is that our laws themselves give rise to crime. They are ferocious and ridiculous.
On the contrary, they are fine laws, the finest in the history of humanity.
Especially Article 58.
Without it, our young state would not have been able to hold out.
It's no longer so very young.
Historically speaking, it is very young.
But look around at the number of people imprisoned.
They got what they deserved.
And what about you?
I was jailed by mistake. They will sort things out and release me.
Side note, they all leave themselves this loophole. By mistake, then what kind of laws do we have?
The laws are excellent. It is the deviations from them that are unfortunate.
Everywhere there is graft, bribes, corruption.
We have to intensify our communist upbringing.
And so forth. He's imperturbable. He speaks a language which requires no effort of the mind. And arguing with him is like walking through the desert. End quote. The guy Solzhenitsyn is arguing with was the Soviet version of the NPC. He has no thoughts of his own, just pre-programmed ideology designed to uphold the system at all costs. And how reminiscent is this dialogue with exchanges you've had with liberals or leftists in your life? Let's take the now infamous slogan, "Diversity is our strength," for example. Obviously, it's an idiotic statement upon any reflection. A country with 10 languages, 10 cultures, 10 ethnicities, and 10 religions is not going to be as strong as a country with 1 language, 1 culture, 1 ethnicity, and 1 religion. Diversity causes division. In fact, divide is the root word of diversity. How could it possibly be a country's greatest strength? But just like this Marxist scholar who defended without fail the very system which imprisoned him, there are countless white, upper middle class, educated, intelligent people in the West today for whom diversity is of zero benefit, who will twist themselves into pretzels to defend the idea that diversity is in fact our strength. So they'll say that we have a lot to learn from the perspectives of other cultures, or that it enriches us by improving our food, or other such nonsense. Because the idea that diversity is not in fact a strength can never even be considered. It's the same with the issue of race differences in outcome. Across the Western world, in every jurisdiction in which black and white people both live, we see differences in crime rates, educational achievement, or income. We see similar patterns of disparity in outcome. But the reigning zeitgeist, which is hegemonic, claims that race is simply a social construct with no basis in biology, and that these differences are due to oppression. And no matter how much evidence there is to the contrary, this doctrine can never be questioned. They'll say it's because of unjust discrimination. If there's no evidence of discrimination, they'll say it's because it's institutional racism. That it's just built into every single institution, even though these institutions are dominated by progressives. And if that doesn't work, they'll say it's the legacy of slavery which causes black people to commit more crimes or not succeed. There's an alternative explanation that the disparities are a result of human biodiversity. This is a much more effective explanation than this oppression narrative because it also explains the much less controversial fact that men are arrested far more often than women, or that Asians often make more money on average than white people within majority white societies. But applying that explanation to the black-white disparities can't even be considered for a second because it would undermine the very foundations of the ideology, and the ideology is infallible. The next similarity between the two systems is that morality is completely intertwined with ideology. Traditional morality held that which contributed to a stable and healthy society as moral, and that which degraded a stable society was evil. And it was grounded in religion. But both the Stalinist Soviet Union and the modern West don't understand this. Under their morality, a moral person isn't someone who demonstrates prudence, justice, temperance, or fortitude. It's someone who simply believes in the reigning egalitarian ideology. So not only can the ideology never be questioned on a factual basis, it can't be questioned on a moral basis either. So someone who doesn't believe in equality isn't only wrong, they're deemed a bad person. The worst kind of person you can be, in fact. So the totalitarian system is reinforced by a moral absolute. That which supports the system is morally good, and that which opposes it is morally evil. From 1918 to 1956, the era described in the Gulag Archipelago, horrific crimes were committed against the populace, but it could all be justified because it was supposedly for a good cause, equality. It was all in order to bring about an egalitarian workers' paradise. And that was the ultimate good, and anyone who got in the way of achieving that was an enemy of the people and needed to be destroyed. Solzhenitsyn writes of the evil such a twisted moral framework can bring about. Quote, "It was granted to me to carry away from my prison years on my bent back, which nearly broke beneath its load, this essential experience. How a human being becomes evil and how good. In the intoxication of youthful success, I had felt myself infallible, and I was therefore cruel. In the surfeit of power, I was a murderer and an oppressor. In my most evil moments, I was convinced I was doing good, and I was well supplied with systematic arguments. And it was only when I lay there on rotting prison straw that I sensed within myself the first stirrings of good. Gradually, it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart, and through all human hearts." This line shifts. Inside us, it oscillates with the years. And even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. And even in the best of all hearts, there remains an unuprooted small corner of evil. Since then, I have come to understand the truth of all the religions in the world. They struggle with the evil inside a human being, inside every human being. It is impossible to expel evil from the world in its entirety, but it is possible to constrict it within each person." End quote. This moral framework in which morality is defined as loyalty to an ideology is the same as the one in place in the West today. It considers being moral synonymous with being progressive. Being a virtuous person who makes positive contributions to society isn't what makes you good. It's supporting feminism, Black Lives Matter, or LGBT rights. You're considered a morally bad person if you're a so-called racist, and you're considered a morally good person if you're a so-called anti-racist. And it needs to be pointed out that the functional definition of racism isn't arbitrarily hating other races. The real meaning of racist is being pro-white, and the real meaning of anti-racist is being anti-white. Under this morality, virtue is determined by someone's intentions, not the actual results of their actions. So actions are considered good if its goal is to bring about equality, regardless of whether or not it succeeds in achieving that goal. Why is Martin Luther King upheld as the secular messiah of progressivism? He was not a virtuous person in his personal life, and his ideas, which weren't even his ideas, they were his handlers' ideas, have failed to improve the lives of black people and bring about equality. Why is Robert E. Lee denounced as a villain when he was a man who embodied virtue in his life and improved the society he was part of? It's because under this framework, morality is only judged by someone's commitment to ideology. Antifa could beat someone to a pulp in the street, but if that person was wearing a MAGA hat, it almost justifies the crime because they're fighting racism. BLM could loot an entire city block and then burn it to the ground, but they're fighting for racial equality, so it's for a good cause. In fact, they'll be nominated for the Nobel Prize for it. And it's this twisted moral framework through which the system is able to justify that which under traditional morality would be considered evil. Because the ideology is considered the ultimate good, therefore any act of evil in pursuit of equality, no matter how delusional, is justified. The next similarity is an extension of the previous one. Not only do both systems intertwine ideology and morality, they punish ideological infractions much more harshly than traditional crimes. A major theme in the Gulag Archipelago is the infamous Article 58 in the Russian SFSR Penal Code. Solzhenitsyn mentioned it in the dialogue with the Marxist scholar. The section dealt with counter-revolutionary crimes. Solzhenitsyn remarks on the all-encompassing nature of Article 58. Quote, "Who among us has not experienced its all-encompassing embrace? In all truth, there is no step, thought, action, or lack of action under the heavens which could not be punished by the heavy hand of Article 58. The article itself could not be worded in such broad terms, but it proved possible to interpret it this broadly." End quote. Not only was the definition of a counter-revolutionary crime extremely broad, it was punished ruthlessly. Being convicted under Article 58 had you officially named a so-called enemy of the people. Solzhenitsyn himself was charged under Article 58 for the crime of distributing counter-revolutionary propaganda in 1945. He was charged for writing a letter criticizing Stalin's conduct of the war and was given an 8-year sentence in the Gulag. And there were far harsher punishments handed out than that. Solzhenitsyn notes that during peacetime, there was only a minimum sentence and no maximum sentence for the crime of distributing counter-revolutionary propaganda under Article 58. An ordinary crime would be punished much harder if it was deemed counter-revolutionary in nature. Solzhenitsyn writes, quote, "The murder of an activist especially was always treated more seriously than the murder of an ordinary person, as in the Code of Hammurabi of the 18th century BC. If a husband killed his wife's lover, it was very fortunate for him if the victim turned out not to be a party member. He would be sentenced under Article 136 as a common criminal who was a social ally and didn't require an armed escort. But if the lover turned out to have been a party member, the husband became an enemy of the people with a 58-8 sentence." End quote. Not only was the law extremely harsh, but the Soviet system would go above and beyond its own laws to punish political dissidents. The very accusation of political crimes was enough to land you in the Gulag or in front of a firing squad. There wasn't really any fair process in which someone's guilt could be determined. because the reigning consensus of those in power was that if no evidence of subversion was found, then the police simply weren't looking hard enough. This next passage captures just how corrupt and unfair the entire process was. Quote, Comrade Krylenko vouchsafed them a flash of his brilliant logic. He said, "If we should admit, even for 1 second, that these people were telling untruths, then why were they arrested, and why did they all at once start babbling their heads off?" Now that is the power of logic for you. For 1,000 years, prosecutors and accusers had never even imagined that the fact of arrest might in itself be proof of guilt. If the defendants were innocent, then why had they been arrested? And once they had been arrested, that meant that they were guilty. End quote. The intersectional West today operates in a similar manner when punishing political dissidents. There's an entire category of crimes for crimes committed by wrongthinkers, hate crime. Now, it's important to note that the acts that fit under the category of hate crime are crimes themselves, but why is there a separate category of its own which distinguish hate crimes from normal crimes? Why is a crime considered worse if the person who did it is a wrongthinker rather than if the same crime was committed by someone who's not a wrongthinker? They consider the act of defying ideology to be worse than the actual crime that was committed. Not only that, there are also hate speech laws in some jurisdictions, which in many countries can land people in jail for a lot longer than an ordinary crime like theft or assault. But these are the actions of the state. A major difference between the Soviet system and the intersectional system is that the USSR enforced ideology with the might of the state. While in the West today the state is certainly active in this regard, it often relies on non-state private entities to enforce ideology. The Soviet Union was extremely centralized. The neoliberal intersectional West is extremely decentralized. In the Soviet Union, it was no secret who was in power, Stalin. It was no secret how he wielded power, the state. But in the West today, the power structure is so decentralized that it's often difficult to tell where the power is coming from. And I'd say this is a lot more robust of a form of control because on paper, it doesn't exist, but its all-controlling power is palpable. And unlike the law under which you must be convicted by a court, with the private sector, there is no trial. So there are some things you can legally say, but it will cost you your employment, your social circles, your own safety. If you hold politically incorrect views, you might not go to jail, but the private sector will work tirelessly to get you fired from your job or to lose your role at a university, or to ruin your reputation and turn your friends and family against you. Many times, these consequences can have an even more lasting impact than being convicted of an actual crime. The most insane example of punishment by the private sector for ideological infractions is that banks have shut down the bank accounts of wrongthinkers. You can be denied banking services, without which modern society becomes unlivable. Do rapists or murderers lose their bank accounts after being convicted of a crime? No, they reserve this punishment for political dissidents because the system is more interested in upholding ideology than traditional justice or order. Another difference is that the Soviet system was maintained by harsh enforcement by the state, while the Western system is maintained through selective enforcement of laws. So it's not just the tyrannical crackdowns by the private and public sectors against dissidents, it's also the anarchism that results from lack of enforcement. To describe this process, Sam Francis coined the term anarcho-tyranny, when the system refuses to police criminals and instead polices the law-abiding, all in pursuit of ideology. Now, Solzhenitsyn does note that while the Soviet system ruthlessly cracked down on dissidents, they actually weren't all that interested in solving a lot of regular crimes. But this is much more prominent in the West today, because the laws are either enforced or not for ideological reasons. The police in Yorkshire will compile a database of what they call non-crime hate incidents, i.e. any display of wrongthink, but they'll do nothing to stop coordinated child sexual exploitation at the hands of Muslim gangs. BLM and Antifa will rampage through a neighborhood of an American city, burning down businesses and assaulting people. None of them will face any consequences. Either the police won't arrest them, the DAs won't charge them, or the judges will just throw out the charges. But any citizen who defends themselves against being attacked will face the full force of the law. In addition to this, there exist countless so-called civil rights organizations designed either to ruin the lives of law-abiding people who hold right-wing political beliefs, while there are similar organizations that exist for the sole purpose of making it more difficult to police non-white criminals. Because it's not the intention of the system to uphold order, it's to uphold ideology. Another similarity between the two systems is that they use relentless propaganda to uphold their narrative, and that they're acutely aware of any imagery or messages which undermine their narrative. Because they are systems that are fundamentally dishonest, reality doesn't line up with what the powers that be tell the populace. So propaganda is essential, but since the system is founded on a lie, the propaganda often paints a picture which is the exact opposite of reality. So Soviet propaganda would show images of fields full of wheat while people in Ukraine were starving. While their industry was failing and workers were living in deplorable conditions, the propaganda would show a superhuman steelworker smashing rivets with a hammer. It's interesting to note that this propaganda was a creation of the state. State-sponsored propaganda certainly exists in the West today, but most propaganda is created by corporations, but the fundamental dishonesty of the messages is the same. Every single advertisement has a mixed-race couple, black man, white woman, even though this is actually one of the rarest relationship couples in the United States. In every Hollywood movie, a 5'3" woman will kick the snot out of 5 6-foot-tall men at the same time. Every single new Netflix series needs to have a gay character. White men are portrayed in advertisements as bumbling idiots and in Hollywood movies as genocidal psychopaths. The propaganda is so on the nose and persistent because it's designed to get you to believe the exact opposite of reality is true. As an extension of this, not only do these regimes put forth dishonest imagery, when reality doesn't line up to the propaganda, they'll put ideological prestige above any kind of empirical reality. Solzhenitsyn writes of the practice of falsifying performance records in the archipelago to satisfy unrealistically high quotas on the Gulag's production, set in accordance to ideology. In the camps, they coined a term for this practice, tukta. If, according to communist ideology, a certain quota must be possible, do you really want to be the one not to deliver? The quotas came from the top, but just like the worker doesn't want to fail to meet his quota, neither does his director. So they engage in what they referred to as tukta. Solzhenitsyn writes of the practice of tukta in the Gulag. Quote, "If nonetheless there is incessant tukta and padded out worksheets, if there is a constant attestation to trenches dug and filled which never yawned in the earth's surface, repair of heating systems or lathes which were never out of order, replacement of perfectly sturdy posts which will still be standing there for another 10 years, then this is done not at the instigation of the camp chiefs, who are quite calm and confident that the money will flow into the camp one way or another anyway, but by zeks themselves, brigadiers, norm setters, foremen, because all state work norms are the same. They are calculated not for real life on this earth, but some kind of unearthly ideal on the moon. A human being, dedicated, self-sacrificing, healthy, well-nourished, and energetic is incapable of fulfilling those norms. And so what are you going to get out of a weak, hungry, and downtrodden convict? The state system of setting work norms prescribes an output impossible on this planet, and in this sense resembles socialist realism in belles lettres. But if the unsold books are easily shredded later, it is more complicated to cover up industrial tukta. However, it is not impossible. In their constant tail-chasing haste, the director and the construction superintendent have, let's say, overlooked or missed noticing, failed to discover the tukta." End quote. Of course, simply fabricating performance numbers doesn't change real-world output, but that's not the point. The point is to manipulate the numbers so that they line up with the ideology on paper, reality be damned. And the West today engages in its own version of tukta. This practice is quite common to make statistics line up with what intersectional ideology says reality should look like. Intersectional tukta, if you will. For example, men outperform women in the physical requirements for the military or the fire department for obvious biological reasons. Now, this can't be taken as evidence that men are better at performing these jobs because according to the ideology, that's impossible. So the answer is to reduce the physical requirements for these jobs so that they can hire more women. Of course, this decreases the quality of the military or the fire department, but the goal isn't quality, the goal is affirming egalitarian ideology. Likewise, in public schools, it's common for black students to be suspended more often than white students. According to the ideology, the only explanation for this is racism, so the schools respond by simply not suspending students for bad behavior. In 2020, a lot of jurisdictions in the United States defunded the police because black people were overrepresented in arrests. Now, this doesn't actually help black people. Obviously, not suspending students for bad behavior is not going to turn them into model students. Not arresting criminals for committing crimes is not going to turn them into model citizens. And this corruption has the exact same root. The ideology comes from the top, So if you're a principal at an elementary school, do you really want to be accused of racism by the New York Times? If you're a training officer in the military, do you really want to report to your superiors that the male recruits are just better recruits? Of course not. You don't want to throw away your career, so you engage in tukta. The next similarity between the Soviet system and the intersectional West is a doctrine which I'm going to refer to as revolutionism. Revolutionism is the complete rejection of all tradition in favor of a new revolutionary ideal which invalidates everything that came before it. Edmund Burke criticized this concept, which I'm calling revolutionism, of the French Revolution in his essay Reflections on the Revolution in France, arguing that they had discarded all the wisdom and virtue of their ancestors before 1789. This is what the October Revolution of 1917 was for the USSR. It was the date at which the old traditional Russian society was destroyed and the new utopian Soviet society was founded. For the new Soviet society, the idea of revolutionism posited that all of Russian history that preceded 1917 was illegitimate. The Romanov dynasty, the arrival of Orthodox Christianity in Russia, the victories of Alexander Nevsky, the literature of Fyodor Dostoevsky, all of it was deemed to have been wrong and supplanted by the new Marxist ideals. The idea of revolutionism, the complete rejection of everything that came before it, was integral to the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the early Soviet years that followed. But this was not so much the case in the later Soviet years. In the 40s, around the time of the Second World War, a lot of the pre-Soviet Russian traditions began to return. Solzhenitsyn comments on the arrogance of revolutionism, not only among the Bolsheviks, but all revolutions. Quote, "And since that time I have come to understand the falsehood of all revolutions in history. They destroy only those carriers of evil contemporary with them, and also fail, out of haste to disseminate the carriers of good as well. And they then take themselves as their heritage the actual evil itself, magnified still more." End quote. Revolutionism is also integral to the tyrannical intersectional ideology dominant in the West today. But the difference is that rather than having a set date like 1789 in France or 1917 in Russia, before which all is rejected, progressivism is undergoing constant revolution. So according to this narrative, not only was the West evil in the 18th century, the 19th century, and the 20th century, it was evil yesterday. According to this doctrine of revolutionism, America was an evil white supremacist patriarchy just last year because Trump was president. And progressivism is even more extreme in its scorn for the past than Soviet communism. Not only does it completely reject the collective wisdom built up over the centuries, it declares all of it to have been evil. Because the narrative it puts forward is that people are all these equal blank slates and the only possible cause for inequality was oppression. So therefore any society that wasn't equal was oppressive. And that would include every society. Apparently gender doesn't exist, meaning that for all of human history, society was just living under this oppressive social construct. Until a bunch of big-nosed cat ladies came along in the mid-20th century to set the record straight. According to intersectionality, not only were Aristotle, St. Augustine, and Thomas Aquinas wrong about absolutely everything, they were evil people. They were all just a bunch of racist white men who didn't believe in equality, therefore their ideas should be thrown away. According to this doctrine, the new revolutionary idea is infallible, therefore all the tradition built up over the centuries which contradicts it should be discarded. It doesn't line up with the zeitgeist, therefore it must be destroyed. And I'd say that the modern form of revolutionism is more robust, because it was a lot harder for the Soviet system to deny its failures after the revolution when they were insisting it's the workers' paradise. But in the intersectional West, they own none of the failures of intersectionality because according to their narrative, we're still living under a white supremacist patriarchy and need more revolution. The entire traditional society which the revolution has supplanted is deemed a metaphysical evil, and the system uses this moral indictment against it to justify its totalitarian rule. Another similarity between the two systems is a strategy that they use to do so. They both leverage animosity towards the traditional society and people who have some kind of grudge against it to bolster support for the regime. This was the case with the Russian Revolution, which wasn't really all that Russian, because many of the people behind it weren't themselves Russians. That's not to say that Russians weren't involved in the revolution, but being that they were the majority population of the country, they were significantly underrepresented. Among the leaders of the revolution, there was a certain ethnic group whom I cannot mention on YouTube who were greatly overrepresented. They had a deep hatred for traditional Russian society, making them fiercely loyal to the Bolshevik regime. Trotsky was part of this group, Lenin was mostly Russian but also partly a member. But it wasn't only them, animosity from other groups was also leveraged, including Poles, Latvians, atheists, or weird sexual deviants. Stalin was Georgian, Felix Dzerzhinsky, the leader of the Cheka, was Polish. And this made it so that the leadership was more willing to brutalize the population. For example, Russians, Ukrainians, and Belarusians were underrepresented in the NKVD before the late 30s, while the ethnic group that I can't mention were enormously overrepresented. There was also an overrepresentation of groups like Poles, Latvians, or Georgians. So if the NKVD were sent to a village in Ukraine or Russia to collectivize the farms, they wouldn't be as likely to feel guilty about brutalizing the population because they weren't part of the people that they were brutalizing. Solzhenitsyn addresses this phenomenon, but this quotation isn't from the Gulag Archipelago, but from 200 Years Together. Quote, "In the months and years following the October coup, the Bolsheviks were only too happy to make use of the services of in their administrative and party structures. Motivated once again not by feelings of solidarity with but by the benefits received from their talents, their intelligence, and their alienation from the Russian populace. Latvians, Hungarians, and Chinese were utilized in similar ways. No sentimental hang-ups could be expected from them. The attitude of the population at large towards the Bolsheviks was guarded, if not hostile. But having attained full freedom thanks to the revolution, and together with it, as we have seen, a true flowering of activity in the social, political, and cultural realms, all superbly organized, did not stand in the way of the rapid advancement of other who were Bolsheviks, and who then exercised their newly acquired power to cruel excess." End quote. And it's also important to note that in the later Soviet era, as Russians and Ukrainians began to occupy more of the positions of power, and other groups were pushed out of power, the Soviet regime became significantly less brutal, because people in power are not as likely to brutalize people of their own group. This strategy of leveraging animosity towards the subjugated people's traditional society as a means of totalitarian control is used in the West today as well. Now, it's important to note that there are many white people who uphold the system against their better interests purely for ideological reasons, but that's not all there is to it. Like with Bolshevism, the same ethnic group who have a strong animosity against European society have in many ways led the charge of intersectionality in media, government, and education. But they also form alliances with other groups who also hold animosity towards the West and use them as shock troops. This includes non-whites, most notably the black populations in Western countries, the so-called LGBT community, or just the kind of weirdos you see in the Antifa mugshots that Andy No posts on Twitter. They're the most loyal to the egalitarian orthodoxy because it provides them high status in a society in which they'd otherwise be low status. So they enforce it with absolute ferocity, with the consent of the system, as we saw across the United States in summer 2020. In addition to using this tactic to galvanize defense of the regime among hostile populations, both systems use a similar tactic to neutralize any opposition from the subject population. If the population stood up together and resisted, the system would collapse, so they atomize the population. Since an individual cannot stand up against the system alone, they fear for their own self-preservation, meaning they'll submit to the tyranny in order to not be the one who gets hit. In the Stalin era, control of the population was maintained through fear. It didn't matter what people actually thought of Stalin's rule, no one would dare step out of line because they knew that the consequences were either the gulag or execution. And it was this neutralizing the population through fear which allowed them to send millions to the gulag. If they had stood up collectively, it would have been impossible, but since they had no collective group through which they could do this, they were only concerned with their own self-preservation. Solzhenitsyn writes, quote, "And how we burned in the camps later thinking, what would things have been like if every security operative, when he went out at night to make an arrest, had been uncertain whether he would return alive and had to say goodbye to his family? Or if, during periods of mass arrest, for example in Leningrad, when they arrested a quarter of the entire city, people had not simply sat there in their lairs paling with terror at every bang of the downstairs door and at every step on the staircase, but had understood that they had nothing left to lose and had boldly set up in the downstairs hall an ambush of a half a dozen people with axes, hammers, pokers, or whatever else was at hand. After all, you knew ahead of time that those blue caps were out at night for no good purpose, and you could be sure ahead of time that you'd be cracking the skull of a cutthroat. Or what about the Black Maria sitting out there on the street with one lonely chauffeur? What if it had been driven off or its tires spiked? the organs would very quickly have suffered a shortage of officers and transport, and notwithstanding all of Stalin's thirst, the cursed machine would have ground to a halt." End quote. This is how political correctness controls the populations in the West today. Now, it's important to note that the punishments for violating political correctness aren't nearly this extreme. You won't be sent to the Gulag or shot, at least not yet. Though there is a minor threat of violence from Antifa or BLM, or being prosecuted under hate speech laws if you're in a country that has them. The primary threat political correctness poses is the loss of employment, reputation, or personal relationships. But its effectiveness as a means of control through fear is the same. What usually happens when someone breaks political correctness is that they're fired from their job, they're slandered in the media, their friends and family are turned against them, and they lose future opportunities. And it's important to remember that the way that political correctness operates is extremely unpopular, certainly with the average person, but that doesn't matter. For example, in summer 2020, when every single person and organization with any amount of power or influence in the Western world voiced their support for BLM. Now, some of them are true believers, but that probably isn't the majority. Instead, those who aren't true believers felt pressured to do so in fear of being the one who doesn't come out in support of the ideology, because then they'll be the target of the mob. Everyone knows the consequences of violating political correctness, which gets the population as a whole to submit to it, regardless of their opinions. Because the individual who steps out of line has no chance against the entire media, educational, and political establishment. But this also gives insight into how to resist totalitarianism. An individual is helpless against this system, but people standing up against it collectively is a real threat. The system relies on controlling the populace through striking fear into the individual. But if the populace as a whole no longer fears the system and stands up against it, it would no longer have the resources to maintain control. That's why this is what they fear the most. The system is perfectly fine with the self-declared anarchist revolutionary LARPers saying they're going to overthrow capitalism, or the rational centrist individualists complaining about identity politics. Because the system will always have more power than them. People standing up together in pursuit of their own interests, that's a threat to the system. These are the similarities between the system of Soviet totalitarianism described by Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago, and the modern intersectional neoliberal anarcho-tyrannous West. I said at the beginning that the Gulag Archipelago is a book for our time. But it's important to remember that the system that rules the West today is not communism, it's something new. They are very different ideologies. Rather, the problem is much deeper than just ideological doctrine. After being exiled from the Soviet Union, Solzhenitsyn gave the commencement speech at Harvard University in 1978. Rather than using it as an opportunity to denounce communism yet again, he criticized the West for its materialism, lack of courage, decline in spirituality, and the corruption of its institutions. He said that the West was on its way to decline and that he would not consider liberalization a viable alternative to communism. Because at its root, the problem was the same. As a result of his time in the Gulag, Solzhenitsyn converted to Orthodox Christianity. He came to the conclusion that the cause of Russia's descent into totalitarianism was, at its root, spiritual. The insight from the Gulag Archipelago isn't simply that communism is a bad ideology. The insight is the danger of ideology itself. The idea that trust should be put into human institution to bring about the perfectibility of man. The insight is the danger of straying away from the natural order, and ultimately, straying away from God. Because without God, anything becomes permissible. Solzhenitsyn writes, quote, "Over a half-century ago, when I was a child, I recall hearing a number of old people offer the following explanation for the great disasters that had befallen Russia. Men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened. Since then, I have spent well nigh 50 years working on the history of our revolution. In the process, I've read hundreds of books, collected hundreds of personal testimonies, and have already contributed 8 volumes of my own towards the effort of clearing away the rubble left by that upheaval. But if I were asked today to formulate as concisely as possible the main cause of the ruinous revolution that swallowed up some 60 million of our people, I could not put it more accurately than to repeat, men have forgotten God. That's why all this has happened." End quote. Unfortunately, the West did not heed Solzhenitsyn's warning in 1978, and now, as a society, is on a trajectory akin to that which he wrote about in the Gulag Archipelago. The underpinnings of totalitarianism which he describes are present in the West today. The rest of the book is dedicated to the nightmare of life in the gulags themselves. While I don't want to understate the problem, I also don't want to overstate it. We are not there yet. So let the rest of the book serve as a warning where the evil we live under today can lead. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Special thanks to Charlemagne for his contributions to this video. He played the part of the Marxist scholar in the dialogue extract. It's vital that at this time we support alt tech. If you're watching this video on YouTube, I ask that you subscribe to me on Odysee as well, where this video was uploaded a day earlier. It will be the replacement for YouTube going forward. I also ask that you follow me on either Gab or Telegram as an alternative to Twitter. And if you'd like to support my work with a donation, you can do that too. All links are down below. Thank you for listening. Till next time, endeavor.